All right. I wanted to bring Martha Carlin back on the podcast to talk specifically about Parkinson's and how it relates to microbiome. We touched on it a little bit last time, and I wanted you, Martha, come on to share your research. I know it's dear to your heart as you lost your husband from Parkinson's. I keep hearing about different people pass away from Parkinson's. Actually, my husband just told me yesterday his friend just had early Parkinson's, just we heard passed away a few weeks ago. And it's just, I feel this need to get this information out there, and you're on cutting edge research. So let's just dive into what you're working on and in your purpose and your why. We talked a little bit before, but kind of share what's going on top of your mind.
Sure. So, if your people listened to me before, my husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2002, and that really set me on this journey of becoming a citizen scientist and translating my business skills over into the world of science and trying to understand what was happening. Um, I've always been a kind of a curious person, and I was trained as an auditor, which is, never take anything at face value, examine the evidence for yourself. And as I began to examine the evidence, I ask a lot of why questions like a little kid does. Well,
That's what
why?
I do.
Why? Like, how does that work? Well, why?
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why? Why? And um, all of that ultimately from 2002 to 2014, I spent a lot of time looking at food and the food supply. And certainly what we've done in the food supply is a huge part of it. And I'll get to that a little bit later. But the microbiome, I had never heard of the term before. And I read Dr. Martin Blazer's book, Missing Microbes. And he was talking about our generation, and he's a little bit older than us, but like growing up in the age of antibiotics and how now we have this rise in chronic disease. And a lot of his research was around what the antibiotics were doing to the gut in these animal models and how it was changing metabolism and all these different autoimmune and various kind of chronic diseases that we have now rather than acute problems where we used to have a more like acute infection or now we have these chronic conditions, and that really resonated with me. And then the first paper was published that showed you could divide Parkinson's into the two primary types. One is tremor dominant, the other is where the posture is bent over and they have trouble walking, and you could divide it by the gut bacteria. And I was like, okay, that is it. That's like the general ledger of accounting. That's where the information is. The system's got a balance. This all makes sense. And so I quit what I was doing and founded the BioCollective to start looking at the microbiome. And it was so early, it wasn't hard for me to catch up in the science because a lot of people were just learning about the microbiome.
Mhm.
And even, 10 years hence, most medical doctors still know very little about the microbiome because they weren't taught about it in medical school and they're not, going to take a course on the microbiome. But we're actually more microbial than we are human. In terms of the number of cells in the body, it's like a 2-to-1 ratio, microbes to human. And then in terms of the number of genes that are involved in producing things like vitamins, hormones, neurotransmitters, all these secondary metabolites that we use to run the body, they're made by the microbes. So if we don't have a healthy microbiome, um, we're in trouble. And what's so interesting, Parkinson's has been around for over 100 years. And if you go all the way back to Dr. Parkinson's, who first identified it,
Hmm.
he said he thought it had something to do with the gut
Wow.
all the way back then. And then, we've gone down all these paths of looking at the brain and looking at the protein folding and looking at all this stuff. And over the last decade, we've gone from Dr. Shepperhan's paper in 2014. There are thousands of papers on Parkinson's and the microbiome, and putting pieces of the puzzle together in different ways. But ultimately, I mean, it does come down to a battle in the gut, and what is happening there with a leaky gut, and the different things over your lifetime that are damaging both the lining and the battle with the microbes. And that lining, so there's something called the glycocalyx, which a lot of people have never heard of. Glycocalyx, an endothelial surface layer, is kind of the fuzzy layer. It's a sulfated polymer that is our protective layer of everything in the body. So most people have looked at there's been more research, I would say, on the glycocalyx as it relates to the vascular system. So that as the protective coating of our vasculature, but it's actually the protective coating of everything. It's around all of our cells. It's that fuzzy coating around everything. And all these different things, including the debris from the microbes, can collapse that system. And that is our system. So let's say if, like the microbes are the symphony, the glycocalyx is the conductor. And some of this debris, either from chemicals in the environment, the debris from bacteria, even like the wrong salt concentration, the wrong sugar combination, all these different things have an effect and can collapse that glycocalyx, which is the communication, the protection, and it's also the transport for oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2. And so if that's not working, nothing is really working very well. And, it goes back to this battle with the microbes. And we actually have been working on this paper to explain how all this fits together and drives the physiology of what happens in Parkinson's and how it progresses over time. And we're having a meeting in May that we're calling stripping the canvas bare, and going back to that foundation and showing how all of these pieces that are coming to play now kind of fit into this comprehensive, like, new thinking about the biology in the body, and this glycocalyx and the communication, and how that explains the gut-brain axis. It explains, what's going on with the chemicals in the food supply, and our lack of nutrient-dense food, and how that's impacting things because we can't make the enzymes we need to move things around. And I know that's a big hairy ball that I just put out there. So.
Yeah. No, it's good. Well, let's kind of my brain is similar to yours. It's the like putting the pieces of the puzzle together and understanding the why. All right. Tell me something is beneficial, but I want to understand mechanism of action. So if we put it in order of operations, as my other organizing the thoughts, that what you're saying is that Parkinson's is not just cognitive decline of the brain. It's coming from that gut-brain connection, and working on the gut health can help improve the brain function, right?
Tremendously. Okay.
And why does this gut to brain connection get disconnected? And going to what you said, you're talking about dysbiosis. So that's, to find that would be overgrowth of the good and the bad bacteria, that we have overgrowth of the forest. The yard hasn't been kept up. Would you say that?
Yes. And like one of the foundational things that we have found that's also supported by existing literature is the gram-negative bacteria, or there are certain bacteria that produce an enzyme called urease,
Mm.
and the urease at body temperature it is produced by those bacteria at body temperature, and they will kill the good bacteria in order to access the calcium and potassium inside the good bacteria. And when that happens, it spills out calcium and potassium and causes this electrolyte instability that propagates throughout the system, collapses that glycocalyx, and it has an impact all the way through the electrical signaling into the brain.
Whoa, that's fascinating. So with the microbiome going kind of starting north, working way south, we get from environmental issues, the food we eat, environmental toxins, all the stuff that can cause the bacteria, bad bacteria. How would we get the bad bacteria dysbiosis? And then we'll connect dysbiosis to how that connects to leaky gut and the gut brain. So I just want to go backwards and start with kind of the foundations.
Okay, so like if you think about terrain, there's a germ theory and terrain theory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of microbes, the terrain really selects for the microbes that are there. So when we, as an example, John grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s and 70s when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. So as a child, he was exposed to a lot of pollution in the air. So there's actually a Dr. Ray Dorsey who's written a book called Ending Parkinson's Disease. And he's kind of tied out. There's also a Dr. Brock who had like a brain first or a body first. And so it's kind of like nasal microbiome versus gut microbiome. And, you think about breathing in air pollution, and that is then depositing certain types of chemicals in the environment. Well, there are only certain microbes that can break those chemicals down. And so you start to have a terrain that is friendly to the microbes that can deal with the chemicals that you've been exposed to, but makes byproducts that aren't necessarily greatly beneficial to you in that breakdown process. And the same thing in the food supply or the foods we're getting. There's a lot of there's heavy metals and chemical pesticide and herbicide residues, and thousands of chemicals that 100 years ago we weren't exposed to that much. So we see the rise in Parkinson's, and people will say, well, that chemical wasn't here 100 years ago. Well, there's thousands of triggers that can make this happen, and they all kind of set up maybe a slightly different terrain, but many of the microbes that can actually deal with those toxins are actually pathogens, and those toxins are detrimental to the good bacteria. So the lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that make a lot of our like B vitamins and hormones and neurotransmitters, a lot of those good bacteria are damaged in that environment. So you set yourself up with these exposures to a more pathogenic than positive environment. And then antibiotics can make that worse because they're kind of indiscriminate.
So how do we get the bad bacteria in? We have these the toxins, the pesticides, herbicides, all that. We get exposed to that? How does it give us bad bacteria into?
Well, I mean, we have all kinds of bacteria in and on us, like trillions of microbes. And when we're in a healthy environment and we're eating nutrient dense food and we have what we need to keep the system in homeostasis, then the bad guys don't overgrow. The good guys kind of keep them in check. But if you set up this terrain that has more of these exposures, then you're setting up the system to allow the bad organisms to flourish, and the good
guards are not available.
Yeah. So, and that's a great example, because in my TED talk, I talk about like the gut, like being sentinels at the gate when things are in balance, but they're not in balance anymore. And so the sentinels are gone, or they're much harder to, you don't have as many of these good sentinels, and you have, more of the,
Yeah.
marauders who are like trying to breach the wall.
Yeah. That's why I always think of it. It's like the Navy, the Armed Air Force, the Marines, everyone comes out, but then I always think, okay, the good guys outnumber the bad guys. So how do they push them away and keep them from entering in? Do they eat them? Do they kill? How do they
Well,
kill them off and get
they,
outnumber them?
so some of it is, so the gut is supposed to be anaerobic. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not supposed to have air in it
Oxygen.
or oxygen. It's not supposed to have oxygen in it. And what we see in a lot of people whose gut is out of balance is a lot of aerobic bacteria, or what are called facultative anaerobes, that can be both. They can live in oxygen or not in oxygen. And what you want is a gut that the oxygen is not available. And so that's one of the things actually we've been looking at with the probiotic that I made originally for my husband. In the clinical trial we did in diabetes, one of the things that it did was it changed the gut back to an anaerobic environment. And so that lowered the number of endotoxin producing bad bacteria and raised those what are called strict anaerobes, like bifidobacteria, that are very beneficial in the gut.
So we get more gram-negative bacteria, endotoxins in the body because of the terrain and external stressors that enter through the body. So we get more negative bad bacteria, and they might start to outnumber the good bacteria. And so then the terrain is not as, our immune system's knocked down. So we're getting more susceptibility to imbalance of the good and the bad, but the endotoxins and the LPS from the bad bacteria that die off, right? And that
Yeah.
contributes to leaky gut. I'm not
Well,
saying that
so
right,
the
but
leaky gut, so
clean that up.
back to endotoxin. I mean, not endotoxin, the glycocalyx. So that layer that is coating, our whole tube is lined with mucus and these little hair-like structures that are
Villi.
protecting us. So if that's colonized by good bacteria and the little hair-like structures are working properly, that's keeping you protected. But if this collapses or gets weakened, then, oh, look,
Oh,
I'm staying on there.
how'd you do that? That was funny.
I don't
That
know.
was add to the story. Okay.
So then what happens is you get holes in the gut, and you can get
Mm-hmm.
holes in the gut from the chemical toxins, from, stress hormones, and then what happens when those gram-negative bacteria die, they have a cell wall that's made of something called lipopolysaccharide, or endotoxin. And that endotoxin can then cross through that barrier and it gets into the bloodstream. And then it can really go anywhere in the body and cause inflammation. And in Parkinson's, we have neuroinflammation in the brain. In arthritis, you have inflammation in your joints. I mean, you can really have inflammation anywhere, but when you have a leaky gut, you are much more susceptible to that endotoxin problem. And, in Parkinson, well, so John was a marathon runner. We talked about that before. And one of the things that I had looked at just when I talked to people with Parkinson's, I had run across quite a few of them who were endurance athletes. And there is some published research looking at endurance athletics and what it does from a stress perspective, and how that can impact the gut barrier. And what they've shown is, when when you do a distance run, you've created this stress, you're creating electrolyte stress. in particular, which impacts that glycocalyx. So you get a
Mm.
collapse of the glycocalyx. You get this endotoxin crossing over, and often an inflammatory cascade the next day after a big race or something. And you're carb loading with a lot of the carbs today are what have more of the chemicals in them. And so if you were carb loading, then you're also feeding many of those pathogenic bacteria. So it's kind of a perfect storm of what you do to build up for the big race. And then you do the big race and you put a lot of electrolyte stress on the body, and you collapse that glycocalyx, which is the protection. And then boom, you get a die off of the bugs, and the
Mm.
cell walls cross over and you have inflammation. And so if you're doing this all the time, particularly if you're a competitive athlete, then you're constantly driving that process and
Breaking down your gut wall lining.
breaking down your gut wall lining and causing this inflammation. And then we don't need to go deep into this today, but I've actually been looking at something called stress erythrocytes. So I don't know if you know what those are, but when we're not under stress, we produce our red blood cells in our bone marrow, and it's called steady state hemoglobin. But when we're under stress, we actually make red blood cells in a bolus. So a whole bunch of them together, and they're made in the liver and the spleen. They are more like a dedifferentiated cell. So they're not like a steady state red blood cell. And there's, if you kind of look at some of the endurance runners and stuff, they often have issues with iron. And I think it's underappreciated. What they don't understand is this distinction between the stress erythrocyte and the steady state erythrocyte, and what these dramatic swings in the electrolyte and nutrient balance in the body, and the collapse of the glycocalyx.
So what are the microbiome, I mean, the bacteria that you find are related, the imbalance that's related to patterns that you see with people with Parkinson's?
So there's been quite a few different papers published. E. coli is one, and that's a urease producer. And it also produces a protein called curly that has also been implicated in Parkinson's. H. pylori, which is also known as the ulcer microbe. H. pylori is a urease producer, and it also, interestingly, eats dopamine. So there's been research showing that like people who have more off time with their medication can often have an H. pylori infection, but they take more medicine, and then the medicine feeds more microbes that produce more it's like this chain reaction.
So H. pylori, people don't know, is in the stomach organ. And so a lot of times when we're doing functional lab testing, we can identify that in a stool test if that's overgrown. But we have a little bit of it, but a lot of people get it too much, and that could cause all these different problems. And a lot of it, I find, is related to poor digestion, especially of proteins that happen in the stomach. And so that's when we always want to test and not guess if you have it or not, because if you give someone HCl betaine to improve their protein digestion because they're struggling with signs and symptoms of poor protein breakdown, but if they have H. pylori, you don't want to give them HCl betaine and make them more acidic. So it's always something to test and not guess on how much of an out of balance are you in your stomach organ. But that's always a huge marker for a lot of people. And kind of more, why is it so common to be elevated in people? What's causing it? And is it related to chronic stress?
Well, chronic stress, I think, is really, really underappreciated. And people think of stress, they're like, oh, my job is stressful, or my mother-in-law is stressful, or that type of stress, but there's all these other kinds of stress. So there's nutritional stress, there's pH stress, there's electrolyte stress, there is, micronutrient stress, where if you don't have enough of the minerals to make the enzymes, that creates a stress. So lots of, components of nutritional stress. There's just spiritual stress. I mean, traumatic stress. There's so many layers to what stress is. And, a healthy athlete who is pushing their body is pushing it into a state of stress constantly. And then one of the things I observed, and I've talked about this a few times, I observe it mostly in men who have Parkinson's, is that they're married to very intense women. And so, if you're living with somebody, and I count myself in that category, that intensity level creates a low grade chronic stress all the time. And that's something I actually try to subtly point out to people, because you may not realize how your intensity is actually contributing to this state of stress. And then when we're in stress, back to the stress erythrocytes, it changes all kinds of things in the metabolism in our body. And that, like stress, the stress hormones feed, again, those pathogenic bacteria. So if you're in a stress state, you're producing more like epinephrine or norepinephrine in stress, and that will feed a certain microbiome profile. And there's actually a really interesting, there's a book called Psychobiotic Revolution by John Cryan and Ted Dinan. And they have done a tremendous amount of research around the microbiome and what's called microbial endocrinology, which is these hormones and the brain and the gut and the sort of back and forth, and how you can get stuck in a loop with producing stress hormones from the way you're thinking, that then feeds a microbiome that makes chemicals that then triggers your brain even more, and you get into this loop.
So what are you finding with all this? We're talking about the microbiome and Parkinson's. What do you feel from your research and your experiences with your own husband? What do you think is the root causes of Parkinson's, in summary?
I mean, I think it's multifactorial, but I do think stress and chronic stress over a long period of time is a huge part of that. And I think nutritional stress is probably one of the big pieces of that that's underappreciated. We live in a world today where we are suffering from high calorie malnutrition. And when we don't have enough nourishment, the metabolic pathways in the body are looking for alternatives, and it can be quite complicated, but like getting proper nourishment, like a whole foods nutrient dense diet, which is takes a lot of work. And we also live in a kind of a fast-paced society where people don't want to stop and cook fresh food, or they want the quick pickup answer, and
In-N-Out burger.
In-N-Out burger, or
Like 50 people lined up all the time. I'm like, what is the deal? So yes, people want fast, easy, quick. They don't want to put the time in to make good food from nature, nutrient dense.
and that, I think that's one of the biggest drivers of all, is the lack of nutrient dense food. And I didn't really fully appreciate that until I would say in the last 2 months. I came across, someone told me to look at the Minnesota starvation study. And so I was looking at it, and do you know who Ansel Keys is?
Yeah. Of course. Hopefully everyone knows who he is.
Well, okay, so he was the
Troublemaker.
troublemaker behind the problem with fat, but he led the starvation study.
Mm.
And the starvation study they did with conscientious objectors during World War II, and they starved them um, on a low calorie diet that was lacking in micronutrients. So, again, minerals, those minerals that are needed to make all those enzymes. And then they looked at like all the different factors that they had and what happened to them after refeeding. And then a group of them they followed up, I want to say like 20 years later. And there were all kinds of long-term impacts,
Mm.
including the relationship with food and um, so
It's
glyphosate is one of
yeah.
my big things I talk about a lot, and I think it is a significant contributor to Parkinson's because it binds up the minerals. So it binds up the minerals so the plants are not nutrient dense, the animals that eat the plants are not nutrient dense, and what we're eating isn't nutrient dense, and we can't access the minerals, so we don't have the minerals to make the enzymes. And if you go all the way back to that starvation study, it's like, okay, we knew that. We knew that, and we set up a food industry all around nutrient poor food.
Yeah.
And
Huh.
it's like, yeah, they're and and now we have this complicated biohacking industry of taking all these supplements, which again, when you're taking mega doses of different vitamins and stuff, you're swinging things, whether it's the pH or the electrolytes or from one place to another, and they're not all very absorbable. So,
Mm.
really the answer is getting back to restoring a healthy gut, restoring a healthy gut lining, and
Mm.
eating whole nutrient dense food. So if you know who Terry Walls is, she's a doctor with
Mm.
MS, but she reversed most of her MS
MS. Yeah.
with a nutrient dense diet. And I just did an interview of a gentleman with Parkinson's who has reversed his Parkinson's from stage 5 in a wheelchair, not able to do much, back to stage 1. And part of that was a very keen focus on his gut, restoring his gut, and eating a nutrient dense diet, and focusing on what food he's eating, uh, and goat milk kefir, which is loaded with minerals and enzymes.
So
Which
what minerals are you saying are the big parts of it?
What minerals?
Yeah, specifically, you said the minerals to make the enzymes. Are
Well, I
there
mean,
any specific
so,
ones?
magnesium. There's like 300 enzymes in the
Yeah.
body that need magnesium, but then people will run out and buy a these big pills of magnesium that aren't very absorbable. The I use something called Ancient Lakes, which is an
Mm.
Australian seabed uh, magnesium mineral. But I use humic and fulvic minerals
Yeah.
from bean
Bean.
minerals
Yeah.
because I think they work with the microbes in your gut to make the enzymes that are needed. And I am trained as an RCPC, so that's root cause protocol,
Mm.
and there's a very keen focus there on copper, iron, and magnesium. But the problem is much more complicated, or I won't say much more complicated, but because of the widespread use of glyphosate for so long, it's far beyond those minerals. It's all of
Mm.
the trace minerals are out of balance now. And I
Mhm.
actually have an article on the Weston Price Foundation in their Wise Traditions Journal from last quarter. I think you can get it online if
Hmm.
you just Google Martha Carlin, Weston Price, glyphosate, and the article will come up, and it talks about a study we did in how glyphosate was impacting the structure of cabbage,
Hmm.
which is in order to make the lignin structure of cabbage to hold up in sauerkraut, you have to have a number of enzymes that require in the shikimate pathway that require certain minerals. And that's also where all the phenols, the polyphenols, all get made in the plants. But glyphosate breaks that pathway. So then your plants don't have the polyphenols they should. The lignin structures aren't strong like they should be. And the same thing in our body, the microbes make the aromatic amino acids in that pathway, and they're involved in our sleep quality, in our cardiovascular health and heart arrhythmias, and in a number of things related to Parkinson's. And so, like, if you're breaking it up here, then like none of those enzymes in that pathway, and there are 3,900 secondary metabolites in the shikimate pathway that are made by bacteria. So if that's not working, like, you're not working very well.
Yeah, I did a great podcast with Amber Vitale on beam minerals, and I'm actually going to do a 90-day experiment for my own self on beam minerals. I'm doing a ligio scan, a mineral scan. I found one in Encinitas near me to go do before and then after the 90 days of doing the beam minerals. So it'd be kind of fun to see my results. And then I do the sugar shift, the L-reuteri yogurt
Yeah.
each day too, so see what happens. So
What's that
I
scan? What does that scan
it's
do?
called it's a Ligio OLIOG scan. I'm going to talk to them next week, but it's a different type of scan because I was thought you have to do hair tissue mineral analysis, but this is a different scan through your hand. I think I was trying to watch a video to learn more about it, but we'll do a video interview with them sometime soon when I
Interesting.
do my own. So let's talk about action plans. So if we want to, ideally, of course, everyone wants to avoid Parkinson's. It's not fun to have a family member, friend go through. It's tragic. What can we do to prevent it? Is there, genetics involved too, but is there anything we can do now? Because my focus on this show now is improve our future self. What can we do now to fix this?
So, well, first of all, the ending Parkinson's. So, Ray Dorsey's book, and he has a new book coming out that has 25 different things you can do to prevent, slow down, or Parkinson's. One big one on his list is avoiding dry cleaning fluid. Like, dry cleaning fluid and these herbicides and pesticides are two, key triggers of what's going on there. And I think that's in that selecting the gut microbiome.
So that, wait, because I have to understand. Don't just tell me that. I have to understand why. How? So is that those goes back to what you said earlier, the environmental toxins, we inhale them,
Mhm.
and then next step, how does that impact the mic? So that's impacting the microbiome
Well, it's going to
because
impact the microbiome, but it's also going to impact that glycocalyx that we
so it's
talked
all
about.
about the glycocalyx more so
Yeah.
than the
I mean,
microbiome.
it's probably more about the glycocalyx.
Hmm. Okay, sorry, go
But
on.
when the glycocalyx collapses, then you lose all this communication and the ability to take up nutrients and, move stuff around.
Because of leaky gut.
That's a collateral damage of the collapsed glycocalyx, I would say.
So that glyco, you have to dive into this. I've
The
never heard this. So
glycocalyx,
glycocalyx.
it is the lining of everything.
Mm-hmm. So if that gets damaged, then we're more exposed to the one cell thick
Yeah.
wall. So we've lost because there's the mucus protection lining we talk about. And then there's a glycocalyx. Like, is that underneath that, or is that part of the same thing, the mucus layer?
That's actually something I've been asking about
Mm.
because I think they might be interrelated.
Yeah.
I
Because I know
think
we
that
always talk about
because
get more of the
their
mucosa
yeah, mucus is kind of a
in the mouth.
gel. Um,
Mm.
the glycocalyx is kind of a gel. So
Mm.
that's a question I haven't gotten a good answer to yet. And like I just learned about the glycocalyx in like the last 5 months. And my mind has really been blown. And like I could see the evidence of what was happening with instability in the glycocalyx with John.
How?
So
How could
like
you see it?
you can see it in like a swing from like just totally fine to like can't move all of a sudden.
So is it more neuromuscular
Um,
symptoms?
I mean, I would say yeah, it presents like a neuromuscular, but
Hmm.
it's, and there's things that affect it. It's not just like the food. So there's other forces. So, light as an example. So like for John, the light in a Costco, like if he'd be walking fine and he would get to the door of a Costco and couldn't move, could
Hmm.
not move beyond like big threshold. So it wasn't like the door, it was the light, and would turn around away from the light and could walk just fine.
Oh,
He was
okay.
very sensitive to electromagnetic fields. Those can also collapse the glycocalyx. So, um, and electrolytes. So, using salt based electrolytes caused really dramatic swings for him.
I'd
And we figured that out and stopped the salt based electrolytes and went to the, you know,
be minerals.
minerals.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. So I interrupted you, but so you're talking about dry cleaning. So kind of like keeping it simple, to fix, to avoid, to prevent, do what we can do to avoid cognitive decline as we get older, to avoid illnesses as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all that in that cognitive space.
So, the simplest thing is eat a clean, nutrient dense diet that supports your microbiome,
What does
supports a
that mean? Because everyone always says I eat healthy. I was like, what does that even mean to you? I think people don't have the right definition of understanding nutrient
right.
density and what that means. What would you say?
Well, you need to have the minerals. So, but, and what I'll say, so if you look at Terry Wall's protocol,
Yeah, it's a lot of
it is,
vegetables.
it has a lot of vegetables. But if you're going to eat a lot of vegetables like that, then you need to have a good microbiome that has microbes that make something called phytase that can get the minerals out of the plants,
Yeah.
or you need a supplement called Good Fight,
Yeah,
which is
I've
a
interviewed them.
um, and because you can't access the minerals are locked
Nutrients.
up in the plant and you can't get it out. Um,
Hmm.
so bean minerals I think is a very good way to support that lack of nutrient density we have in
Hmm.
our food today.
Okay.
So
So
um,
getting a nutrient dense food, whole foods, more animal based, do you think? I mean, no, Dr. Davis talks about the organ meats, and I don't do any of that, but smash fish
I
diet,
mean
getting
the organ meats are, part of the reason why organ meats are also helpful is they have more connective tissue.
mm,
And the connective tissue, like collagen, is what builds the glycocalyx, is that sulfated
mm,
polymer.
put
So,
that down. So
it's chondroitin sulfate and hyaluronic acid. So, in animals, the connective tissue is that's what it's made of. So when you're
Okay.
making a bone broth, you're getting, if you're making a bone broth with connective tissue in the bones, you're that congealed broth that you get, which if you're buying broth at the store, it's not congealed.
I've said
You've
that for years. It doesn't
you
do
have
anything when you put it in the refrigerator.
yeah, you have to have a bone broth that congeals like jiggles like
I
jello.
know.
You take
That's
it out of
the
the refrigerator. That's what supports your glycocalyx. And that is hyaluronic acid is a fiber, and it's a fiber that will help feed the microbes.
okay. Pause there, everyone. If you do kettle and fire, if you do what's the doctor lady? She has her own bone broth. I mean, all these bone broths in the carton, they do not do that. I've said that for years. I used to sell bone broth in a freezer at my fitness studio for years. And I did this test myself. When you have extras, you put in the cup in the refrigerator so you can heat up on the stove, not the microwave, the next day. And it should have that layer of congealed. And then I figured that out. And you try the stuff from the store, the aisles in the carton, they do not have those ingredients to do that. So don't use that kind. If you're
And
looking for
it's
this.
it's not hard to make.
Yeah.
You need a big pot, but it's not hard to make. I mean, you throw your bones or your chicken in the pot and
Just let
you
it simmer.
let it simmer real slow with some salt and pepper and a piece of celery and a carrot and an onion. Like that is
Yeah,
not gourmet cooking.
I
And
know.
you let it simmer real low and slow, and you get this nice jelly like broth. And like for me, if I'm in a hurry for a meal, so back to that, like I'm in a rush, I mean, that's a great, makes me satisfied,
Mm-hmm.
just heating up a cup of broth. It's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. And
Okay.
that's actually one of the things Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, I would
Mm-hmm.
recommend her
The GAPS diet.
her gaps, because it's very focused on healing that lining and
Mm-hmm.
getting that lining healed first. So that's really your first step, is fixing that lining and getting the lining healed and restoring your gut. And
Mm-hmm.
fermented foods are a great way to do that. Obviously we focused on probiotics, not, and if you're going to get sauerkraut, like you need to make sure it's got um live cultures, because like a lot of the stuff on the shelves has been pasteurized. It doesn't have any live cultures. So you're
People
looking
don't
for,
know that. Pasteurization means no live cultures. That's the result of the pasteurization. So that's good note to self for everyone.
so you're wanting live cultured fermented foods, or ferment your own. That's not that hard either. And things like kefir, goat milk kefir. I mean, they're not always easy to find, but if you can find a good goat milk kefir, is going to have more minerals, more
Mm.
microbes, more enzymes. Make your own. You can buy. So Cultured Food Life is a great source for um, culturing for, water kefir or milk kefir, dairy kefir, and making your own yogurt. People make their own yogurt with our all of the different probiotics in our lineup, and um, you start to restore the function in your gut, and that's where a lot of your vitamins are made. So you're making B vitamins in your gut with the bacteria using the minerals. So and that's kind of what we've lost is, so if you did nothing else, that would be the main things you would do, is
Mhm.
restore your gut lining and restore your microbial self.
So the ingredients to support repairing the glycolic, gly, the gut wall lining. We need to look at what the ingredients are missing parts in the microbiome. And the bacteria that's in your Dr. Davis, you're suggesting L-reuteri is the best way to repopulate your microbiome to help with
Well,
this
reuterize
or what
one
other.
because it gets rid of, in the small intestine, of a lot of these bad guys, and so does sugar shift, which has an L-reuteri in it. But and I'm trying to cut back on the supplements, but
I know I'm trying to, I was like real food first. It's ideal.
So you might be interested in talking to Dr. Hans Vink. He
Mm.
founded his company is called it might be glycocalyx.com, but he has a product called Revasca endothelial glycocalyx support. But
Oh.
when I look at it, so it has fucoidan, so that's coming from like seaweed.
Mm.
It has Vitrinox, which is a brand name for a polyphenol from grapes. It has Vacamannan, which is from aloe vera. Again, something that helps repair the gut. Aloe vera juice can help repair the gut. Also, sea moss can help repair the gut,
Mm.
and it's mineral dense. And then it has hyaluronic acid, which we talked about, and then it has two enzymes, catalase and superoxide dismutase. And superoxide dismutase makes hydrogen peroxide, and then catalase breaks the hydrogen peroxide down into water.
Mm. Yeah, I
So
think it's making sure people work with the practitioner so they know order of operations, what's best for you. And do you suggest people to do any lab testing or genetic testing when they're trying to improve their health as they age and avoid Parkinson's and other?
I think that lab testing could be very helpful. What I would say is a lot of people don't really understand Parkinson's from a metabolic perspective.
Mm.
And so, I'll give you an example is one of the things that we're going to be talking about in our paper. There's a big Chinese study that is supporting this, but that battle in the gut and the calcium potassium, you essentially have elevated blood potassium. But if you think about here in the States, well, first of all, neurologists don't ever do blood tests, so there's not a lot of data on Parkinson's people. But you're also you're doing your blood work on those in a fasted state typically. Okay, so the body is constantly fighting for equilibrium with
Mhm.
you know, sodium and potassium, especially. And in a fasted state, the body's already kind of gotten to that equilibrium. So when this is occurring, like after you eat, you've fed the microbes, they're having the battle. These guys are winning. They spill the calcium and potassium. You get an elevated blood potassium.
So we should do blood testing after a meal, not do fasted.
I think for that purpose, yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, so where should people start if they're trying to restore their gut bacteria with your research you've done and the products you have as their kind of, I think your personal passion is to help people avoid Parkinson's, I think after dealing with your husband's
Well,
health.
what I typically tell people is, if you're not in a great state of health, go low and slow. You have because what happens when you start to reshape the microbiome and kill off the bad guys, then you'll get an elevated endotoxin or what's called a Herxheimer, and you might not feel very good and you'll stop what you're doing. And what you need to do is just go about it very slowly. You've got to start restoring the gut and then slowly working on shifting the microbiome. So like I'll have people either start, I mean, if you don't have a lot of sensitivity and gas and that sort of stuff, you can start with our probiotics in 30 days. It makes a pretty dramatic difference in endotoxin. In 180 days, even more dramatic, a very significant change in our clinical trial. But if you are very sensitive to fermentable fibers, or FODMAP, then I would start with a low FODMAP diet that is very focused on restoring that glycocalyx through food. And I would use, I would look at Natasha Campbell McBride's work. I mean, has really been a pioneer in
Yeah,
this
that's where
area,
I first learned about it.
and it works, and it's whole food based. It's, it's making that collagen that's feeding the glycocalyx and
Mhm.
that your gut lining.
Hmm. Yeah, it's replacing what we've lost, as Dr. Davis talks about the L. reuteri, the bacteria that we've lost. But same with the glycocalyx, you're looking at what ingredients make up that lining and replacing that. And it's the same thing I'm talking about the gut to glow protocol and skin health and improving our skin health and improving our muscle health as we age. I say this every single time, but don't blame the aging process. We just have to adjust and add what we're not making or getting enough of anymore, and add the B minerals, add your probiotics in your food and fermented food, or make the yogurt, and really get all the hyaluronic acid from organ meats. If you're not going to do organ meats, and myself, we have to supplement that area, like omega-3 fatty acids. I was just doing a video. I'm not doing the smashed fish. I'm not eating salmon every day. So I need to supplement because I'm not getting it in my diet. But that's when we need to supplement. Ideally, we want us all to get our food nutrition from real food, nutrient density, and not have to take any supplements. But
But
magnesium, I
it's
find
very
you have to.
hard. Yeah, it's very
Yeah.
hard today to do that. And then, for somebody who's already got advanced Parkinson's, really looking at trying to um, focus on getting nutrition. And that
Mm.
can also be very difficult for people who are on medication, because the protein will often interfere with the medication, and the ability to break down protein is already a problem. And so there can be sort of this vicious cycle of not eating enough protein to keep your muscle mass. And, I think we'll start to see in the next 5 years, more nutritionists and health coach type people who start to understand diseases like Parkinson's, because we have more people with Parkinson's who will really start to understand that better. And I did a podcast with a nutritionist, Critical Conversations, Heather, I can't remember her last name, but she pointed out to me that actually in her Parkinson's people, hypoglycemia was more of an issue, which is again back to not getting enough, and back to the starvation study, not getting enough um,
Minerals.
and minerals and nutrition, and
Mhm.
to make the energy.
So it's almost that start with nutrition, what we eat, how, when, why, and making sure if you're not able to have proper digestion, you have some enzymes, but maybe some pre-digested protein is taking essential amino acids and getting omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil, or what you need, but just to feed the body what it needs and getting the good specific bacteria, good bacteria to help. So where can people learn more about your Parkinson's research and studies and everything you're doing?
So they can learn more about the Parkinson's research on my Parkinson's blog, which is called Martha's Quest. And if they're interested in the probiotics, they can go to BiotiQuest.com, or we have a YouTube channel where I do a lot of recorded talks about Parkinson's, about the microbiome, about microbes, minerals, and how they work together. And we have an Instagram channel. It's at BiotiQuest.com, and we're finally figuring out how to actually post content on there. And so we're really starting to post a lot more educational material about the microbes, the microbiome, and all of these connections to what's going to help us be healthy.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate what you're doing and continue to follow your purpose and your mission to help educate others to help, hopefully, ideally, to avoid Parkinson's. And if you do have it, can we reverse it or
Well, I
improve,
mean,
slow down?
the gentleman in the UK went from stage 5 back to stage 1. And John, when I first made the probiotic for him, there's something called a UPDR score, which is how they score how advanced you are. And the higher the number, the more advanced. And his score in 27, beginning of 2017 was a 35. And he started the probiotic. And, it's not a magic bullet by any stretch. And he was also focused on diet and exercise is also helpful. But within a month, he was no longer walking with a cane, and we could see in his microbiome in 120 days a total shift back closer to a healthy human microbiome, and his UPDR score dropped to a 20, and it was at a 20 for 4 years. It was totally stable. It did not change. He did not get worse. And then he got COVID, and he had long COVID symptoms. And actually, in September, when he passed away, it was from a pulmonary embolism that was likely from the long COVID, which also connects to damage to the glycocalyx. The spike protein can replicate in the gut in the E. coli bacteria in the gut and can further damage the glycocalyx.
Wow. Oh, amazing. So it's, taking ownership of our health today and doing whatever we can do to be our best self in the future is what I'm trying to share, what I'm learning and thinking about. And it's really, figuring out, as you said in the beginning, how does that work, and being curious and keep going deeper. Okay, how does that work? And then you kind of start to unravel things a little bit more, and they start to put the missing pieces of a puzzle together, that going to the deepest layer at a cellular level, but working on the gut brain connection and working on what's missing, what's out of balance, and let the body restore itself back to homeostasis with its own innate intelligence, just giving it the ingredients it needs to create this metabolic harmony.
I love that. That's a great way to say that.
Well, we'll end there then. So I'll put everything else in the show notes. I'm sure there's lots we forgot to talk about. So I will make sure we add some links in there, and anything else people can do a Q&A session. We can do another time, but just add your comments in the show notes. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me back, Debbie. I always enjoy talking to you.